Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Now, the Hamas massacre on October 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza have exposed a fissure within the America First, or MAGA movement. A new cadre of anti-Zionist voices, historical revisionists, and others led by prominent voices like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, dubbed by many the woke right, have been championing America's adversaries from Putin to Russia to Iran to communist China, and now indeed to Islamists and terrorist organizations under the auspices of being America first and it seems other countries and the rest of the world last. How did this divisive trend infiltrate the MAGA camp? Can the America First movement reclaim its conservative soul? Joining us today to discuss this is a Middle East Forum writing fellow and the former producer of Kash's Corner with Kash Patel and Fallout with Dr. Robert Malone, is Karys Rhea. She is an ambassador for Israel365 Action. She's a rising leader at the Global Liberty Institute and a recording artist on Baste Records. As always, we welcome your audience questions, so during this discussion, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of the screen if you would like to ask your question. With that, I will welcome Karys Rhea. How are you?
Thank you, Anaf. I'm good. It's really great to be here with you talking about this. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. At first, as I was saying before we went live, it kind of seems like a topic that might have gone stale in a couple of weeks, but it kind of seems to just be giving and giving. Now, a lot of the people on the right who use the term woke right, I think don't really know what it means and kind of use it as a sort of all kind of catch-all for somebody who's on the right being described by other people on the right as the type of right that they, don't subscribe to or don't like. How would you define the
Mm.
woke right?
Mm. Yeah, it's kind of a shame because this term has been thrown around by all different people to mean whatever they want it to mean. But I saw early signs of this group coalescing actually in 2022. Kanye West at that point was featured on Tucker Carlson's show, and it came out shortly after that he was a pathological anti-Semite, and yet instead of essentially disowning this person as a member of the conservative movement, Candace Owens doubled down and was one of the people in the MAGA space that was recklessly defending him at all costs. At the same time, we heard from an article in, I think it was Vice News, or maybe Vox, I'm not sure, that on that appearance with Tucker Carlson, Kanye West had actually said some deeply anti-Semitic things, explicitly anti-Semitic, and Tucker Carlson had cut that out of the final version that aired on TV. So that led me to kind of question some of these conservative pundits' alliances, right? And whether there was maybe an anti-Zionism and an anti-Semitism that was brewing from within that camp. Now, after 10/7, this exploded online. And what we saw happen was an informal cast of characters kind of rose from the ashes to a new X that had been freed, if you will, by Elon Musk, that suddenly had millions of followers, these right-wing influencers. Nobody had heard of a lot of these people before, and they were pushing an agenda that, though it was cloaked in conservative values such as family or faith or freedom, and though they claimed to be pro-Trump, it was utilizing the very same tactics as the woke left. It was embracing an identity politics. It was utilizing devices such as postmodernism and things like, as you mentioned, historical revisionism, moral relativism, and we can go into specific examples of this. And so that's how this term arose. I thought I coined it back in the day, but then I realized that's ridiculous. There were other people that had actually been writing about it as well, like Catherine Brodsky in the early stages, and James Lindsay and Konstantin Kisin. Um, but as you mentioned, this is just a term that has kind of been thrown around, and there have been other labels to describe these people. The reactionary right, the revisionist right, the Antifa right, the barbarian right, the new right, neo-Buchananite. So whatever you want to call them is fine, but we all recognize that there is a new informal group of people. And I say informal because it's not like they're united. I mean, there is kind of a core inner group, which is kind of incestuous, and they all go on each other's podcasts for sure, like Tucker and Candace and, Dave Smith and Andrew Tate and Dan Bilzerian and Ian Carroll. But there's actually a lot of people in this space. I've mapped out about 100 of these figures or so, and some of them don't even like each other, right? There's infighting. So and they also come from disparate camps, right? There's some neo-Nazis and fascists and groypers like Nick Fuentes and Jake Shields. And then there's also libertarians and paleo-conservatives. And there's also some people from the Maha Health Freedom movement. And there's some Christian nationalists. So they come from all different walks of life, but they are united by themselves claiming to be pro-Trump and part of the MAGA movement, when I would argue that, in fact, it's not just that they're anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, but they are fundamentally anti-American and anti-Western, to the point where, as you mentioned, they are in lockstep with America's enemies and denying that they are our enemies at all.
Yeah, absolutely right. And one thing that you brought up that seems to kind of be the central pillar of all this is this new sort of, some people have called it the manosphere or the Twitter sphere. You get these figures like Jake Shields, like Dave Smith, to an extent even Joe Rogan. You get these figures from all over the place. And what's interesting to me, of course, Twitter is kind of their main hub for
And
disseminating
TikTok.
content. Yeah, and just for exchanging their ideas, it seems. And as you mentioned, their podcasts. What's interesting to me is that they have this common, we'll call it, the woke right. They have these common ideologies, and watching it progress in lockstep with world affairs that they hadn't even heard of up until very recently, right? Like one thing that was crazy to me was when Jackson Hinkle, that conservative right-wing influencer on Twitter, he actually attended the funeral of Saeed Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, just to kind of, own the Zionists or to stick it to, the globalists. What do you make of that progression?
So I would take issue with your characterization of him as a right-wing influencer. He is a self-declared communist. And I think the reason why people think he's right-wing is because Tucker Carlson put him on his show. That elevated him to a place of fame. I mean, he's just one of many of these influencers that Tucker has elevated and given them the cachet that they now have. And he had him on to talk about the Ukraine war. And he is infamously, pro-Putin, aligned with the axes of resistance, Iran, North Korea, um, uh, Russia, and as well as kind of the smaller rogue countries such as Venezuela and Cuba, and we would argue Qatar and Turkey here at the Middle East Forum. So he essentially got elevated to fame, and so people must think he's a right-wing guy, but in actuality, he is just as left-wing as they come. I mean, he used to be like an environmentalist, and I think he ran for city council, as a Democrat, as a progressive. So
Yeah, see,
um,
I,
but
I, I,
but
I had no idea. It's just,
but the reason why this is so confusing is one of the reasons we call these people woke right is because in some ways they are indistinguishable from the woke left. And so you're not really sure where right begins and where left begins. And I think this is a manifestation of what some people have talked about, which is called the horseshoe theory, which is this idea that contrary to the popular belief that the political spectrum is a straight line with right and left on opposing ends, in actuality, it's a horseshoe. And if you get further enough to the right or to the left, you end up looping back around and you tend in the same direction, and the philosophies get close to mirroring one another. And so that's why you see people that are part of the woke right increasingly speaking to and endorsing proud leftists and proud communists. I mean, it's no secret that Glenn Greenwald has always been a friend of Tucker Carlson. He's a proud Chomsky acolyte. But there are more and more people that these people are. I mean, look, last week, Tucker Carlson had on Ben Cohn of Ben and Jerry's. And, he was speaking to him and essentially nodding along and agreeing with this guy's views on foreign policy, everything from Ukraine to Israel to Iran. So, and yet Tucker is able to save face with the conservatives because in his little monologue or his little caption, he'll say something like, you might disagree with him on everything, but listen to his views on Ukraine, right? And that's how he gets away with essentially endorsing this person. And if he did, in fact, disagree with him on everything, then he would have been pushing back throughout the interview, which there was virtually none of. So, so that's another way in which these people are woke, is that they've essentially found common cause with leftists and also, as you mentioned, with Islamists. There's a new red-green alliance, but it's now red with the communists, right? It's red with the Republicans. And I think this is one of the ways that we see this manifesting is the fact that not only in the embrace of like Qatar and Iran, but also just in the fact that in their intersectional hierarchy, in which Christians are now like the top of the totem pole in terms of being the ultimate oppressed group, they are completely ignoring the persecution of Christians by Muslims. They deliberately ignore it. And they say that the aggressor and the oppressor is Jews and Zionists and, globalists and what have you. And so it's very curious that these people have embraced this kind of Christian identity politics, and yet they are deliberately avoiding the topic of Christian persecution and Christian victimhood, that where they would have to actually come down hard on Islamists for that. So, a lot of people have pointed out that there's like a new red-green alliance forming, but on the right. I think even Sam Westrop has written about that at Middle East Forum.
Yeah, he's been writing about it for some years now.
Mhm.
Um, Real quick, we have a anonymous attendee in the audience who asks, "Sorry, I came in late. Who are you talking about that used to be an environmentalist and ran for Democratic office and is considered woke right?" We're talking about Jackson Hinkle, who
Right.
I just recently, moments ago, discovered is a left-wing communist, despite hanging out essentially in these sorts of weird circles.
Hmm.
But
There's a lot of people like him that are leftists, and people just think they're right now because, but I mean, it's not just that the woke right is embracing our enemies, our global enemies. They're like state enemies. They're also embracing people who conservatives are just generally fighting against, like globalists. Like globalism is a key part of Trump's offensive foreign policy to go after, right? He's very against technocrats and this idea of a one world government and these international multilateral organizations that are trying to co-opt national sovereignty, like the European Union and the United Nations, right, under the guise of climate change or whatever they're trying to achieve, right, and the World Economic Forum and Davos and everything, and yet these leaders in the woke right, they are often speaking to people, to technocrats and to globalists, like Jeffrey Sachs is a perfect example, who want to see exactly this type of vision. And this is one of the reasons why I say they are totally anti-American. They are anti-American in the same way that the left is anti-American. They want to tear down the current order, the post-World War II unipolar order, in which America is kind of policing the global stage and is the one that smaller countries rely on and aren't dependent on. And they want to create a new America in their own vision, which is a neo-isolationist America in which America is completely withdrawn, focused 100% on domestic issues. And this sounds really great in theory. And it's no secret that Trump is no neoconservative, right? He is 100% trying to remove America from foreign wars and trying to condense the military industrial complex, which has become so bloated, and redirect resources, especially to fighting in the Indo-Pacific, but also at home. Um, and so there is a kernel of truth to that, that there is a different posturing, a different foreign policy under Trump than previous administrations. But they are trying to gaslight us into believing that this policy is an isolationist policy, which is essentially no different from an appeasement policy, right? Because if you actually withdraw and you don't consider what China is doing in Taiwan and Russia is doing in Ukraine and threatening, Poland and the rest of the Eastern European countries, and you don't consider the threats that Iran is making and advancing in the Middle East towards Israel, but also the Gulf countries, then essentially you are looking at a world that is completely ruled by these rogue, aggressive nations, the CCP, Russia, Iran. And you see a world in which BRICS is now the leading currency of the day. And since nobody can rely on America, there's going to be more nations that join it. And you see a world in which all these countries that previously depended on America are now cozying up to China. So it's a completely unrealistic prescription for foreign policy. And not only that, it's utopian in the same way that the leftists embrace a utopian vision of, human rights in America and all this, just totally unrealistic ideas. So that's another way in which people say that they are similar to leftists.
Now there's a lot in that sort of globalist versus nationalist bit, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the new Red-Green Alliance,
Mhm.
and of course, this really kicked off in the wake of the October 7th attacks, and it really blew up online. And so we know that they have a very strong position on the Israel-Hamas Middle East affairs.
Mhm.
What's interesting to me is that recently, in the outbreak of conflict between India and Pakistan, uh, who would ever think they would have a dog in that fight? And somehow they have been aligning themselves with the Pakistanis against India. They choose to align themselves with the Islamists again. It has nothing to do with Israel or the Jews.
Mhm.
And it seems to me, it seems that it just comes from the Islamists, whether they're in Pakistan or in Hamas, and they have like a mutual hatred of Israel and hatred of the Jews. And so
Yeah.
they just their only principle seems to be the, enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so now we have, other conservative influencers taking a stance on in support of Pakistan. What do you
Mhm.
what do you make of that?
Yeah, it's hard to know what these people's motivations are because again, they come from really disparate groups. Some of them, it might just be exactly as you said, like purely their ideological anti-Semitism pushes them to essentially cozy up to Islamists. But there's also been the question of foreign funding and foreign influence that maybe Qatar or even Iran is backing some of these people. We saw that Russia was backing Lauren Chen, um, a very well established conservative commentator on the Blaze TV, and she was very, very, very anti-Zionist and very anti-Israel. And it was discovered that Russia was actually funding her entire media outlet, and so she had to. I mean, she's disappeared. Nobody has seen her since, right? I mean, it was completely the end of her media career. And she had actually taken to like criticizing Trump and I think things like that as well. And we found out that it was kind of Russian money behind her. So there is that question for some of these people. Maybe they might just be doing it because they are getting funds from enemy countries. We saw Qatar try to do that in 2018 when they focused on, I think there was, 250 conservatives that were close to Trump that they specifically targeted, including prominent Zionists and Jewish Zionist voices. So there's no reason to think that they're not doing that now. Um, but it's very difficult to know who, there'd have to be some deep intelligence operation, forensics to discover whether that in fact is the case. And then there's also just the grift, right? I mean, these people, we know that what sells online is outrage and extremism and clickbait, right? And so like that, just stuff that is sensational. So the stuff that is more extreme sells. And as conservative influencers see that there is a market for anti-Semitism and for going against the typical conservative or even just Trump's vision, then there are people that could pick up that mantle as well without any sort of understanding ideologically of what that means. So there's a big question as to motivation here, and I think it's different for different influencers and different public figures.
Now, there's a sort of irony going back to the sort of this sort of globalist versus isolationist thing. A lot of it boils down to the schism in the right, I think, between traditional
You mean
conservatives,
globalists? You mean like isolationists versus like
or excuse
nationalists?
me,
Yeah.
yeah, nationalists and globalists. Sorry,
Yeah.
um,
Nationalists versus globalists. Yeah.
there's so many terms involved.
I know.
There seems to be a divide among those lines inside of the conservatives uh, that is kind of the schism between traditional conservatives and the libertarians who are more isolationist, who are more America first. There is a sort of irony with the isolationist nationalists taking such strong stances on international affairs. But getting to the heart of that, I think a lot of this was really exposed during that last Joe Rogan episode where he had Douglas
Mm,
Murray and Dave Smith as guests.
yeah.
And the I wish that conversation had gone different directions personally,
Yeah. Me too.
but it still exposed a lot about this sort of circle of what we call the woke right versus the circuit and the kind of circles of people who I would consider, I hate to use this word now, but who I would consider experts in this field.
Mm,
People, John Spencer, the chair of urban war studies at West Point, went up against some of these figures afterwards, and it's just that divide is just becoming so much more apparent.
mhm.
Can you comment on how that's
Yeah, and I understand. I understand that divide. I mean, look at what happened during COVID, right? I mean, I consider myself uh, a like health freedom advocate MAGA person, right? Like I was very sympathetic to the people during COVID who were whose voices were suppressed and who got canceled and shut out of social media and who were demonized by Biden and Fauci just because they said the lockdowns didn't work and we shouldn't be masking children and these vaccines don't have really great clinical trials behind them, whatever. Like that was a community that I was very sympathetic to and even a part of with my work at Epoch Times. And we saw that as soon as people raised differing opinions, they were immediately shut down because they weren't considered an expert or something like that. And we were just all supposed to blindly trust this establishment class. So I don't think that there is anything wrong with questioning established narratives or even relitigating history or coming up with, alternative, putting forth alternative information that's not being acknowledged by the government or the media or any of our major institutions. So I understand that with that arose in that environment that leads people to be very, very distrustful of anybody who's claiming to be an expert or a part of the establishment or the corporate class or the political class, right? Whatever sort of elite environment people come from, where there's messaging being pushed from top down. I think we should have a healthy discernment of things that are coming to that, of information that's coming from those realms. But if you end up being so black-pilled from an experience like COVID, then you end up standing for nothing because everything seems like a conspiracy to you. And you end up going down this rabbit hole and you eventually arrive at the Holocaust, which is now we're seeing that on the right. We're seeing right-wing figures take up Holocaust denial and Holocaust distortion and revisionism as part of, their stick it to the man, personalities, and as part of them being, confrontational and anti-establishment and stuff like that. So you still have to have your 2 feet on the ground, and you have to be able to discern what is reality from what is just complete, you know, complete conspiratorial falsehoods. And one of the problems with the woke right is that, unlike the left, they are not just resurrecting Soviet anti-Zionist and left-wing pro-Hamas talking points, but they're also resurrecting these very like medieval conspiratorial tropes, anti-Semitic tropes that really lend themselves to, Christian theology, like the deicide charge, or things like, you know, Jews were kidnapping Christian children in 1930s Germany, and that's what led to the Holocaust, or ideas like supersessionism, that the New Testament has replaced the Jewish covenant with God, and therefore, you know, therefore Judaism is completely null and void, and the new Israel is actually Jesus Christ and the New Testament. So these we see it from all we see all these new angles from which anti-Semitism is recultivating itself in the right, and it's very disturbing. And we see how politics is downstream from culture, and that if more and more hearts and minds are changed by these folks, and they create a new normative politics for the MAGA Trump movement, that could trickle up to policy. And we see that the more the people that are in the Trump administration that maybe are not as hawkish as like Marco Rubio or something like that, we see those people being embraced by the woke right, and suddenly, they are the champions, right? And then they end up, and so then they love that they're being embraced by these people, and then these admin officials end up, going in interviews, just regurgitating their talking points about, the warmongering neocons who are trying to stop them and stuff like that. And it's really playing into their hands, and it's really a shame. And they're all going on Tucker Carlson, and that's really not it's not in alignment with like their vision as America First MAGA Trump conservatives, and yet they believe that Tucker Carlson is in alignment with them, and he's absolutely not.
Right, and I read some statistics somewhere. It might have been Tucker Carlson. I can't remember the exact influencer, but they their average piece of content has more views than the population of the state of Israel. And just the amount of influence they have over some of these narratives and topics is just astounding. But
Yeah.
going back to what you were saying about these new, or sometimes like I guess resurrected anti-Semitic tropes and lines. One thing you talked about earlier before that was how they kind of get away with it. One thing I've kind of I've tended to notice is they'll kind of use these oh, don't mind, I'm just noticing, or I'm just a pattern
Noticing.
observer, and
Hmm.
noticing seems to be the big one now. These kind of
Right.
dog
With a
whistle
G, with
comments.
the G at the beginning of it. GNOTICING.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's any old post about anything on Twitter now, and you just see a whole horde of those comments. What are
Yeah.
what are the others, some of the other ones that you've kind of come across, like some ways that they kind of keep getting away with this while still being while keeping their conservative card essentially.
Right. Well, there's the whole just asking questions defense, right? Like, look, I'm not saying that Jews killed JFK. I'm just asking the question, right? So that is a defense that they use to kind of cover themselves. But also, they they really go after and demonize anybody who criticizes them or takes issue with their view as somebody who's trying to stifle their freedom of speech, right? I mean, free speech and a love of the First Amendment is really part of the MAGA movement. And so if you take issue with something that Tucker or Dave or any of these people say, all of a sudden you are anti the First Amendment, and you are trying to abridge their freedom of speech. And that is that is so twisted that they are allowed to give their opinions, but we are not allowed to give our opinions of them. I've never called for Tucker to be kicked off of any platform or, for any of these people to not be allowed to say what they want. That is what makes America such a unique and incredible country, that we don't have these ridiculous hate speech laws like they have in Europe, where you're not allowed to deny the Holocaust. Like, hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. And maybe unlike some Zionists in Israel or in other places, I'm not one that believes that they shouldn't have the right to say it or that it should be illegal at all. And I don't see conservatives in America, Jewish and Christian, that are calling them out saying that. They are not saying that you should be canceled for this in the sense that you should be like, deplatformed or demonetized. But they're saying you have your view. No, I have my view. And my view is just as legit as your view. And yet they push back on that as if it's an example of cancel culture. And that can be very, very effective with young, especially like young MAGA conservatives. They're like, oh, the neocons are just trying to cancel them, right? And they use neocon in the same way that leftists use the term like racist, right? Or white supremacist. That's how the woke right throws around these terms like neocon and warhawk and warmonger. They do it so recklessly without any discernment for what the people that are criticizing them actually believe. And in a sense, that's actually a better example of cancel culture than any points that we're trying to raise, because they're essentially trying to shut down discourse. They don't want to hear any criticism of them. If you critique them, you are a neocon, and therefore you are inherently, you're just they that's a you're dehumanized. Like, that's not an appropriate stance from which to have an opinion to begin with. Um, so I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, they're so during the it seems to me like the term neocon or neoconservative kind of vanished and died for a few years there since uh maybe the last 10 years or something. And it has just only now made a resurgence again. I recall a moment in that Dave Smith Douglas Murray episode on Joe Rogan when Dave Smith calls Douglas a neocon, and he kind of smiled and he's like, "Oh, it's good to hear the N-word again."
I don't even remember that. That's hilarious.
But to that discussion that they were having there, and kind of what you were saying here, nobody is getting on them about their platform or their right to say what they're saying. It seems the main debate here is you have this enormous reach on this platform, and just like with everything else, you should use it responsibly. And when you start bringing on people like Ian Carroll or other Holocaust deniers and historical
Yeah.
revisionists,
Then
it
be
takes you
prepared
down
for the
to,
pushback.
yeah, yeah. And then it seems like when someone like Douglas went on to the show and said, "Look, and that's basically what he said. The criticism is then, oh, so you're just appealing to authority now. You can't now you can't have an opinion unless you're an expert." That
Which
seems
is
to be a
so,
big
and it's
that's
so
just
ironic because if you look at where these people take their views from, they are appealing to authority, whether it's the Catholic Church or whether it's right the UN with their ridiculous calls of genocide, or whether it's Hamas and their casualty numbers, whatever. Like, they are just as much appealing to authority as anybody else would. They're just not using the word authority or expert. They're not saying the experts say or whatever. They're trying to make it seem as if it's an alternative anti-establishment view. So there's a lot of hypocrisy with
right.
these
They'll
people, but they use the language that people want to hear, that young MAGA conservatives want to hear, and so it's effective. And it's really unfair to even be demonizing neocons to begin with. Like, I'm not a neoconservative. I think history has shown that the George Bush era of nation building and trying to impose democracy from the top down has largely been a failed experiment. But that doesn't mean that I think these people, that every single person who believed that is it, was just doing it for profit, or is in their heart of hearts, they really just want war and violence and bloodshed. Like, it's it's a left-wing identity politics tactic to essentially take a group like that and demonize them across the board just for, a failed endeavor that it did. I mean, it did cause a lot of bloodshed, and I think in a lot of ways it was wrong. But in 10 years, we might find that something that we all believed was, we failed in that point of view as well. So this is just the course of history and the course of different political movements that pop up and political philosophies. And I don't think it's fair that they're using that in the same way that the leftists use like racist or white supremacist.
Yeah, it really is. It really has just become a bit something of a slur. And on that whole authority, the appeal to authority thing, you mentioned this earlier, COVID really left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths when it comes
Mhm.
to like experts or,
Yeah.
people. Um, and it really is frustrating when there are people who devoted their entire lives in intelligence or in the military or in the foreign service only for them to just be, called neocons and warhawks and have their motives questioned just for
Yeah.
being professionals in their field.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a shame. I agree with you. I agree with you. I think that the I think that the woke right has essentially taken up this mantle of identitarianism, in a way where they see people as categories, and they'll tell you that you're not actually engaging with their arguments, but in actuality, they are quick to put a label on anybody who disagrees with them or who does engage with them on the level of argument. Um, and so yeah, I see a lot of hypocrisy with these people to begin with, and they're very powerful mainly because of Tucker Carlson. Like they are influencing millions of people online, and Tucker has more followers just on X than there are Jews in the world. But I think that he is the link between kind of the culture and the state, and he has the ability to influence policy, in some ways that have been covered by the mainstream media, and in other ways that I think are probably happening behind closed doors. And I think he is creating, in atmosphere that wasn't there during the first administration at all, right? I mean, we saw for example, the 2018 bill that was making, boycotts of Israel illegal in the sense that you wouldn't get foreign funding for it. That passed with bipartisan support in 2018. And I think Mike Lawler just introduced an extension to that. And this time it was shelved because the pushback was not just from the left, it was from the right this time. It was from the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Thomas Masseys, who essentially are saying this is an abridgment of our freedom of speech. We should be able to boycott. We should be able to boycott whoever he likes, and that's like a very simplistic, misunderstanding of the bill, but it appeals to conservatives because it is using the language saying that this is a censorship bill. In reality, I mean, anybody who's read it knows that that's completely farcical. That this bill is very similar to, for example, Trump's executive orders, and the actions he's taken with college campuses, where he's saying, look, we're not trying to censor you. You have free speech, but if you are going to be working against America's interests, then just don't expect to do it on our dime, right? So this bill is very similar. This is saying, in your private life, individually, you can go boycott whoever you want. But if you're an institution or a business or an organization and you're engaging in discriminatory boycotts and you're expecting to receive federal funds, that's not going to happen. Like that's not our position. The Trump administration is not going to be funding that. It's against our values, and we represent the American people because they voted us in. So that enhancement was supposed to include international organizations, I think like the EU and the UN, which would have been great. But now there's a new movement on the right that is just confusing terms here, and so as a result, that's being shelved.
Well, just to we're probably running out of time here. We ran out of time moments ago, but just to wrap up here and to sum up what we've been talking about today, what do you think can be done inside the Republican Party or amongst conservatives to kind of to mend the schism between this woke right and what we would call traditional conservatives. It seems like both sides they're not willing to give.
Well, I don't think, well, by traditional conservatives, do you mean like Trump's, like the original MAGA vision? Because I don't think that's traditional. I think that's like a populist movement that has kind of actually redefined the Republican Party. So I think the schism is really between like the original kind of MAGA vision and then this new, more, isolationist and
Yeah, that's
libertarian and, Buchanan revivalist faction that
yeah,
is claiming to be
that's an
part of the
important
movement.
distinction. That's an important distinction you make because there are people in the MAGA camp who don't belong to the woke right, and yeah, you're right.
No, I would say most of us don't. And
Right.
I think that the problem is that the woke right is gaslighting us into believing that their vision for America is the MAGA vision for America. And I would argue that it's absolutely not. I mean, even just in terms of the neo-isolationist front, like that is not Trump's vision. Look at what he did during the first administration, taking out Qasem Soleimani and, destroying ISIS, right? I mean, this is not a non-interventionist foreign policy, right? This is a peace through strength foreign policy, right? And yes, it's true he wants foreign restraint, but that doesn't mean he's not prepared to carry a big stick and make sure that our enemies fear us. And the only way that our enemies are going to fear America is if they believe that America is willing to act on its threats, right? And and you can't do that if you have an isolationist foreign policy because nobody's going to trust that America's going to do anything to stop you. So you can just, wreak havoc in the international arena, and there's going to be no consequences to that. How do we stop this? I mean, I think for one thing, this has got to be part of like mainstream conversations within the conservative right. Like this has to, like legacy media has to be talking about this. There isn't much of it on the right, but Jordan Peterson started bringing it to the attention of Fox News. Um, and obviously OAN and Newsmax, they have to be speaking about this. Um, I think people of influence need to be talking about this. Like Megyn Kelly, for example, she's very close with Tucker Carlson. I'm not sure if she realizes how much Tucker Carlson is his worldview is so fundamentally different from hers. Um, so, like I said, there's a lot of gaslighting going on. And because these people are still conservative when it comes to like specific issues, like opposing gender ideology or CRT, then there are popular conservative pundits that believe that they're on our side, but their fundamental worldview, their greater worldview and their vision for America is so opposed to what MAGA wants to see and anybody supporting MAGA. And so I think this needs to just get into the cultural conservative space. It needs to be mainstream. And I think that there's a lot of really great forces probably working behind the scenes. But I think that's the first step is really just bringing it to the conversation. And I think we cannot be scared to name names. I mean, I have nothing to lose, so I have no problem calling out Tucker Carlson. But I've had a lot of conversations with people of influence, and they've told me that though they agree with me, they are scared to call him out on their shows because they don't want to lose followers that are also followers of Tucker Carlson, right? And I think that's a big problem. I think that the truest test of patriotism is country over party. And so if people are scared to call out people within their own camp, then that essentially means that the conservative movement has not a pro America party, or the conservative party is not pro America. It's actually just tribalist. And it's no different than, the Marxists and communists on the left that chose party over country every time, or like the Maoists, right? So I think we absolutely need to be call, saying the names here.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Karys. I wish we could continue this conversation endlessly. Uh, as always, it's good to talk to you and get your views. For our viewers and listeners, is there somewhere you would suggest where they can go to follow more of your work?
Yeah, I'm very active on X. It's just my name, Karys Rhea, but reversed. So it's at Rhea Karys. And I'll have an article coming out soon that I'm having trouble getting placed in a conservative outlet because the conservative outlets are very loath to call out Tucker Carlson, but hopefully that will be out soon. Um, and yeah, that's really where my public opinions are shared is on X.
All right, fantastic. I will be sure to put a link to that in the video description below if you're watching this on YouTube. For our viewers and listeners, I thank you again for joining us and for your participation. I hope to see as many of you as I can next week at the Middle East Forum's 2025 Policy Conference, Statecraft Reimagined in Washington, D.C.
I'll be there.
Karys will be there as well. And as always, we thank you for your viewership, participation. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Thanks.